Good night, good night, good night. Alternate views, welcome everyone. This is Kimar Stewart, and welcome to Alternate Views. Yet another Thursday, we are back. I want to say how happy I am to have you all uh, this Thursday, the 25th of April, 2024. We have our early guest in the comment, so let us acknowledge those early persons. Let me welcome you all again to a fine evening a fine evening on Alternate Views. Welcome Juni Rock. We were first person in at 2:52 p.m. this evening. Welcome Juni Rock. You were here early. Thank you very much. We had Square 4 saying, "Hail Kimar, I'm excited." This advertisement looked great, as I said before in the previous chat. Economist, Mr. Forte is one of my top economists that you follow, so look forward to listening and learning from him tonight. We have Gal Biz. Welcome, Gal Biz. I want to say how happy I am that you're here. Good evening to you. Good evening to you. Good evening to Keith as well. Sir Alfred Benjamin, welcome to the show, sir. I want to say how happy I am to see you in on Alternate Views. Yet another Thursday. Welcome to the show. Marcia, good evening. Happy to have you in. Welcome, Mervyn Marius. Thank you. Rhonda Paris. Welcome this evening, Rhonda. You were one of the early patrons. So welcome to you, Rachel Thornhill. Good evening to Rachel. Welcome to Alternate Views. Emerson Bob. Good night and welcome, Emerson. And Emerson is saying greetings from the United Kingdom. So I want to say happy evening to all of our viewers this evening who are over and abroad in the diaspora. I want to say to those persons who are in England, to those persons who are in America, to those persons who may be in further Europe, welcome to Alternate Views. I want to say a special good evening to those persons, our brothers and sisters who are across the Caribbean. Whoa, let's give that guy a time to pass. So, yes. Jamaicans or Togolese, Trinidadians, Antiguans, Vincentians, St. Lucians, the whole works. Not to call some and not the others, but everybody in the Caribbean. And good evening to all Barbadians and welcome to our Alternative Views this evening. Kimar Stewart. And we are ready to go, viewers. So this evening we'll be having economist Carlos Ford. He'll be coming on a little bit later on this evening. Uh, we get our regular discussion going, and then he join us around 7:30, I believe, and we jump right into the budget recap there and then with economist Carlos Ford. Many of you know we would have had Mr. Ford on the show previously, where we discussed a range of economic issues, but specifically this evening we are handling a budget recap, as Carlos was notably absent for the budget responses for 2024. Um, if he wishes to, he will share some light there. But it is always a very good discussion with Mr. Ford. I hear him putting out his views and perspectives in the public sphere. And Carlos is a very solid economist and one we need to take note of. But in the interim, we always start with a quote from alternate views. But before we do that, I want you guys to like the stream and share the stream. So far, we're up at 67 persons. The more persons we have on the live, the better. So don't forget to like, and share. The more persons you send the live to, the better the discussion. And we would want you arming yourselves with questions if you have, and let us engage. So like, share, tell a friend, um, whatever suits you. The information is there for public consumption, and you, the viewers, have been telling me how much you appreciate the perspectives that are shared on this platform. So, what are we discussing this evening? Um, this evening, I want to touch on one topic briefly, and this topic is that of the credit rating of Barbados, or the general credit rating aspect of the Barbados economy, right? Um, and I want to touch on this credit rating issue because I keep hearing persons in general, even people who call into the radio programs, even here, some economists as well, speaking about this issue of credit rating, and people who made comments on the credit rating of Barbados. We heard the governor of the central bank speaking about Barbados's credit rating and how it's been upgraded or downgraded 6 notches, and persons in general may be asking, well, how come we were borrowing so much debt and we are not being downgraded? Well, we had less debt before and more downgrades, and we have more debt now and no downgrades. And persons were a bit confused as to what was happening. Uh, Credit rating agencies. Now, a brief, I don't relate to start with the historical facts. A brief fact is that Barbados was downgraded approximately 23, 24 times, approximately, during the last political cycle, right? It should have been under the former finance minister, Mr. Sinclair. Now, what is interesting about the credit downgrade, or the credit downgrade during that period, is that Barbados was not borrowing, or well, let's just say not borrowing, but Barbados was not borrowing from the IMF. We were not in an IMF program at the time. We were borrowing from the IDB. We were borrowing from the CDB. Those are two standard institutions we borrow from. And then outside of that, we borrowed from the local sources, so the central bank, the national insurance, treasury bills, and then we also borrowed from the private banking system, which is like Credit Suisse and JP Morgan Chase and the other, Deutsche Bank, these big private banking institutions. Okay. So these institutions that the government will go and borrow money at a specific interest rate cost. Um, we were borrowing from private capital markets. So The downgrades that we were getting were based on the fact that we obviously not borrowing. So the amount of money that Barbados was consuming locally in terms of debt from the national insurance, debt from the central bank, the treasury bills, whatever. There was a concern floating around in the economic circles that the government may not be able to afford to repay its debts, which is international debts, because the reserves were low. So in 2018, when the administration changed, the foreign reserves of Barbados, and quoting from Alternate Views, the book, right? Quoting from Alternate Views, the book, I'm at page 25, and it says here that reserves or foreign reserves in Barbados rose from US $220 million, which was approximately about 4 to 6 weeks import cover. And you know, the import cover would just be how much money you got that could import goods, or how much you could cover 6 weeks of food imports if the country went broke or something had happened. You had 6 weeks of money. So political officials were debating back and forth about foreign reserves and how low the foreign reserves were, and the foreign reserves were decreasing. Right, they were low, as they quoted 220 million US at May 2018. Right, so Barbados, um, being downgraded, obviously, are yes, our credit rating was already rock bottom at that time. Right, this was 2018. I'm trying to find the specific section in the book to quote. We were already at rock bottom at the time. Right, so credit rating already down. Nobody would lend us money. When I mean nobody, I mean the international financial world, right? Because Barbados's debt levels were climbing. They said about 157% of GDP, reserves going low, potential oil crises were coming, large debt payments were coming, so Barbados was facing a problem, right? So you had at the time, or Barbados had at the time, a decision to make. Either we were going to continue as we were economically in terms of management of the finances of the country, in terms of engaging the IMF or not engaging the IMF. Right? I think it was said by the former prime minister at the time, which was Mr. Stewart, or I would say it was the way he expressed himself is there was no intention of taking Barbados to the IMF at that time, right? So, as opposed to entering into an IMF program, because remember at the time, the also former Prime Minister Onafa would have been recommending that Barbados also go to the IMF. So we had different perspectives contending at the time as to where Barbados could go economically, right? So Mr. Stewart was saying or insinuating no IMF. Mr. Arthur, former Prime Minister, he was saying IMF. The opposition leader at the time, who was no Prime Minister, she had no substantive position on it. Her position was, if we need to go, we will go. That was the opposition leader, who's now the Prime Minister. That was her response before the election. After the election, it was later admitted by the individual that the work program or the IMF program was drafted at least 2 years before the 2018 general election, and the BERT IMF program, they claim they were able to sign it in record time because they were planning it 2 years into the general election. Right? So in comes the BERT plan. Um, Barbados borrowed uh, January 2022 approximately 1.2 billion US. So the foreign reserves in Barbados rose from 220 million US at May 2018 to 1.2 billion at the end of January 2022. This is 2024, so 2 years ago, right? And the increase in reserves, as you all know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, it doesn't take a doctor, a lawyer. As everybody would know, the money was borrowed money, right? The money was borrowed money. So while we were borrowing money, remember we had a massive jump in reserves. Right? So while we were borrowing money, Barbados's credit rating was going, but they say it was improving. It was going up, right? So I want to read to you some documentation from one of the credit rating agencies, right? So that you can understand and see for yourselves exactly what I'm speaking about in terms of the credit rating agencies. I'm going to share my screen in 1 second. Okay. So as of August 2023, which was short last year, it says that Barbados's credit rating was upgraded. Like, I want y'all to remember that Barbados is still banned from international credit markets. And when I say international credit markets, I mean the JP Morgan Chase, the Credit Suisse, the Deutsche Banks, those private banking institutions who lend you money to do capital projects, right? Because remember, the IMF will lend for lend policy loans, the CDB lend policy loans, the World Bank will lend loans to help you achieve economic and political and legal policies. But these banks, which are the private capital banks, they help us in terms of trying to finance the project. So the same higher, right? If we had ability to go on the private capital markets, we could have built higher, right? If we could have borrowed from Credit Suisse and JP Morgan Chase and those banks, we could have had the financing available to undertake the capital works projects as necessary. So that is the reason why the tax rates are so high, i.e. the BERT program, whatever, right? The monies that came into Barbados, right, was monies that was targeted to certain areas of the economy, right? So the development institutions, the IMF, the CDB, the EU, the IDB, these development institutions will lend you for public goods. So you know what a public good is: roads, hospitals, right? And infrastructure. So you might get some money for like, but that changed no. But you once upon a time you used to get low-income housing loans. You get loans to buy buses from Transport Board. Right? So any public institution or any public good, the IMF and those will lend money for those purposes. But for private profit-oriented goods, right? But the IMF will never lend Barbados money to develop an oil industry because that is making private profit. Right? The IMF is not there to develop private industry. That is not their role. Right? So that is where these private banks come in that we are banned from. I remember we are banned from these markets because the government defaulted. So as a penalty for default, right? As a penalty for the default, we got banned from borrowing from private capital. And that is the reason why we locked in there. And that is the reason also we have to borrow money from the Chinese, because the Chinese are one of the few countries in the world who actually lend you to do projects. So Salars Castle in Barbados, money comes straight from the Chinese at Zimbabwe. That is called bilateral country-to-country lending. So HCC Barbados utilizing that facility, country-to-country lending, and China being one of the leading economies in the world to provide country-to-country finance. Hence the reason why Barbados borrowing for China, because realistically there's nobody else in the world that is lending you the money like China and at the rate China are lending it at. So credit rating upgrade. It says here Moody's Investor Service has today upgraded the government of Barbados issuer ratings from B3 to B3 from CAA1 and maintain a stable outlook. And the key drivers behind the rating decision are pre and post pandemic fiscal consolidation. We discussed what that is on the show already, right? So it's not the fancy term out and use a simplistic term. That's basically raising taxation, cutting back on state-owned enterprises, reducing funding from central government, privatizing institutions. Other fiscal consolidation, coupled with a strong economic recovery, meaning that some of these sectors will recover. We will get back some tourists, the country will open up, but we don't know if it was strong. But Moody's is saying a strong economic recovery having led to a declining debt burden. Right? So Moody's is saying that Barbados' debt burden declining. Right? So I ain't saying that I agree or disagree. I asking you, the people, to tell me, the viewers, to tell me, in your assessment of Barbados, the debt burden declined to you. Right? If you think the debt went down in Barbados, if you think that the debt went down, I invite you to come on the show and defend that perspective tonight. Right? Because as far as I can see, debt has been increasing. Right? The only debt reduction, I don't call it debt reduction, but it was one of the most draconian exercises in the world in terms of world economic history, where the government in a debt restructuring wrote off close to $5 billion in a debt restructuring. Just writing off that 4 billion or 5 billion is what they're referring to, as you can see it there from Moody's, is what they're referring to. But the government has not been paying down any debts that would improve. But that's what Moody's saying. So, implementation of a durable structural reform, which will support achieving higher fiscal primary surpluses. A lot of fancy language again, but in a simple way, implementing the reforms to the government offices. So national insurance, carrying out the pension age, privatizing water authority, private, right? Cutting the printing of money from the central bank, reducing the amount of monies that government borrow from it. And yes, all of these are structural reforms, right? Supported by higher fiscal surpluses, meaning that simplistically, the government is earning more than it spends through increased tax revenues, industries, and overall increase in revenues, along with a cut in expenses. So the government cutting back all the expenses. That's why some government workers, um, you will see the gang put on short days. That's why you see no some of the government departments shutting down. That is why you see um, implementation of digitization, right? So that is why you see all of those things happening because you would consider that to be a reduction exercise. No, right? Everybody agrees that the debt seems to have increased, but Moody's is reporting that the debt burden has decreased. So I keep showing you people where there are discrepancies in what the government is reporting versus what these agencies are saying about Barbados. Government liquidity risk coupled with an adequate foreign exchange buffer. What that means? Simple terms. Reduce government liquidity risk, right? So that they're just basically saying that the what was that? They're basically here saying that the possibility of government not having the money or the cash flow to do what it has to do is reduced, which means that the government has enough money to do what they have to do. They got buffers, they got leeway, they got leverage in terms of revenue, right? Because remember, I said that this government has collected the highest levels of tax revenue ever in the history of any government. But remember, I told you that. So tax revenues are fairly high right now, you know. So the Moody's is reporting that the government's liquidity risks are fairly low, right? And that they have the adequate foreign exchange buffers to back up. So the foreign exchange buffers would be the same borrowed money from the IMF, the IDB, and those people. So anytime you see this word foreign exchange buffers, you know that, right? Anytime you see the term foreign exchange buffer is borrowed money, borrowed foreign exchange, borrowed foreign exchange that the government got from that market, right? And they just have it stored away there. So anytime you see that term foreign buffers, you know what it means. Right? So moving past that, because I don't want to get too. So it says here now, Barbados's local country ceiling has been moved up in line with the sovereign rate and is now set between the three-notch gap between the sovereign rate. It's getting a little too technical, but I gave you the gist of what Moody's is saying. So Moody's has upgraded our so-called upgraded Barbados credit rating from B3 to from CA1 to B3. Now let me show you on my screen. Right, I shut that on for 1 second. So I'm gonna show you now on my screen what or how does Moody's or what is a Moody credit rating. So I am getting that on the screen for you. But in the meantime, let me just acknowledge some more persons. We are up at 182 persons. So I want to encourage you all to share. Um, and I'm happy to have you here. I see Mr. Ford in the lobby, so we're going to segue into him. But we're going to continue this discussion much later, and we're going to have a segment where we delve deep into this credit rating issue and how Barbadians perceive this credit rating scenario. So, again, my name Kimar Shur. I'm your host this evening of Alternate Views. So, welcome to you all again. We're up at 177 persons. Let's not forget to like and share the program. I am seeing Mr. Forte in the background, so he's going to signal me and let me know that he is ready. And then we're going to let him into the program. So, yes, so there we go. We have Carlos Fort in. Um, we're going to be discussing the Barbados 2024 budgetary proposals. We're going to do a recap. As I said earlier in the show, Carlos is usually a very vocal person who brings robust intellectual analysis, economic analysis to the public discourse of Barbados. And Carlos's voice was absent for this year's budget. If he wishes to share, as I said earlier on the program, he would explain to you, but we missed him hearing his voice, contributing with David Ellis, contributing on other programs, um, contributing on other programs in the public space. And as we said, we had him on Alternate Views, and that was one of our most watched programs, which means that the crowds, the people really love you. So welcome back to you, Carlos. Good evening to you, and very happy to have you on Alternate Views. Good evening to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Kimar, and good evening to you and your guests, those all of and the audience who are watching and participating during the chat. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm
Thank you.
thinking, yeah, I will be guided by you. I don't know if you want me to jump straight into my comments on the budget. I did capture the tail end of some of your comments on the credit ratings, and I could add my voice to I guess a general description of the credit ratings. I have heard from time to time people questioning how is it that the country has not had any downgrades given the magnitude of the debt or the high debt levels, the fiscal deficits, and so forth. Some people have posed the question against the background of the debt restructuring and question, I would say, the integrity of the rating agencies or their motivations. I think at least what I heard in the last 5 or 10 minutes before I came on, what I heard you describing, Kimar, I think is it does have some credence, and I think from the outset it's important for people to understand that credit ratings are paid for by sovereign countries who wish to have a credit rating for the purposes of borrowing on the capital markets, or certainly borrowing commercially from banks and other financial institutions. It isn't a case where credit rating companies impose themselves on sovereign states or corporations who procure the services of credit rating companies. And there's one of the key points I would like to make. And I suppose some semblance as to why Barbados has had some downgrades in recent times is explained reasonably well in the reports of the rating agencies themselves. And I can sum it up by saying that having had a debt restructuring, Barbados would have defaulted, a selective default once the debt restructuring process was initiated. Um, Once that process was completed, to restore some health to the public finances, the ratings, once they resume, would likely go up from default, which is the lowest that you could be where the credit rating scale is concerned. Apart from that, Barbados has entered into now 2 IMF programs. And in addition to IMF financing, it has been able to access multilateral financing from the likes of the Inter-American Development Bank, Caribbean Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, etc. And in so doing, the foreign reserves have risen to record levels, just under 3 billion Barbados dollars at the last reporting of the central bank to the public. And most of the government's borrowing since the restructuring has been from the multilateral institutions at concessionary rates. That is not commercial debt. Credit ratings are for the purpose of accessing commercial debt, and that is government issuing bonds or other securities on the capital markets, both internationally and domestically. And from the point of view of not only the credit rating agencies, but those creditors who hold Barbados's debt instruments, particularly foreign debt, now that the country is in a stage where it has robust foreign reserves and it is accessing concessionary loans, that means it has money that is available to pay those bonds and debentures when they fall due. And in addition to that, one of the positive results of the debt restructuring is that the interest burden, or the debt servicing attributed to interest, not just principal, has been reduced because the existing debt was restructured so that maturities would be extended and the interest rates that were due on those debts would have been reduced. So the cost of government servicing that debt has been reduced. And those two things have increased the government's ability as an institution to be able to pay its outstanding commercial debt when it is due. So basically, in lay terms, from the point of view of the credit rating agencies and existing creditors, Barbados has access to foreign exchange to pay foreign commercial debt when it is due. It continues to be able to access multilateral loans, and therefore, notwithstanding its indebtedness in terms of the level of debt it has, the ability to repay the existing debt, particularly the foreign debt, has improved considerably. Having said all that, though, the credit rating is still below investment grade, what would be colloquially called junk status. And therefore, even though there's been some measure of improvement, that improvement has not been steady enough and sustained enough to see the debt rating increase sufficiently back to investment grade debt level of debt. So what does that mean? That means that Barbados's debt situation is still of some cause for concern.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Carlos. You actually solidified the initial points that came up in the show. So thanks very much for your explanation and clarity and for people to understand. Um, I think it was a brilliant explanation so that the people understand that raising is still really a jump of no tangible benefit um, to really be having credit upgrades at this point because you rightfully say credit ratings are for commercial debt, private capital that you borrow at private banks and not necessarily the multilateral institutions. So I mean, it will cause for a further show on it. So we'll discuss it at a later time. But what we're really here this evening on alternate views, um, we are doing the budget recap. When they say budget recap, we mean the budget that was presented in the House uh, of Assembly by the Prime Minister Barbados, Mia Motley. As you know, we all heard the budget, and we did a show and we did a post-budget show. But what we really wanted to get here was Carlos Forte's view on the budget. So we'll do extensive recap here tonight about the 2024 what Mr. Fort thinks. Now we're gonna let Mr. Fort lead off the discussion as to what he thinks about the budget uh, at large. Also, we want to hear some comments from him. Saying, remember, this is not a political platform, but the fact that politicians make policy announcement on economic issues gives the impetus to making some inference to the political space. So in light of that, I want to hear if he has anything to say about the response. If he did listen to any of the issues that were raised by the new constitutionally appointed office in the opposition leader of Barbados, given the fact that that office was basically non-existent in practice for some time. So we're gonna let him lead off, and then the discussion would flow from there. But thank you all again. We're up at 212 persons. Time it quickly, so they're just gonna ask all of you on the live tonight. Don't forget don't forget to share. Don't forget to let people know that Carlos Fort is on. And after we're going to take some questions. So if you want to be on, just let me know and we'll bring you on the end. But over to you, Carlos.
Yes, thank you, Kimar. So I would, my introductory comments, I would try to make them as brief as possible and to provide the opportunity for you as well as the audience to pose questions to me regarding the budget. I this year was not in a position to respond or comment on the budget, I suppose, in real time, due to some family matters, pressing family matters that I was attending to at the time. I must confess that during the presentation of the budget, I was able to listen to some of it, and I was able to capture or listen to some of the response from the leader of the opposition as well. And I quietly thought to myself that it wasn't particularly unfortunate that I would not have been so disposed at the time to comment on the budget, because I was woefully disappointed with what was presented as the budget. After 4.5 hours, it has become a trend in the last 8 years or so to have these lengthy budget presentations. And I say even for analysts such as myself, it is quite taxing to listen to what, for all intents and purposes, have become a very meandering presentation that is lacking in focus. The To my mind, the budget failed to make contact with the most pressing economic issues and challenges that the country is confronting. There was precious little on the cost of living and the havoc that the high cost of living and increase in prices over the last 2.5 years have been having on Barbadians and their daily lived experience. Some may be quick to say that the budget sought to address the whole question of economic growth and sustainable economic growth. And I would agree that it sought to do so. The extent that the policies as enunciated are likely to do so is another question. And I don't have particularly much confidence in what was enunciated as being either targeted or of sufficient scope to address the whole question of sustainable economic growth going forward. I would challenge most people almost for a month on to name 5 measures in the budget that were enunciated that really stands out as being able to use the government's, one of the government's lingo words, to transform the economy and put it on a place of sustainable growth. Moreover, the budget did not provide the nation with an update as to government's policy program with respect to reforming statutory corporations or state-owned enterprises, referred to as SOEs, which is a major plank of the first IMF program as well as the second one, both extended fund facilities, BERT 1 and BERT 2. There was precious little in the budget that sought to address that, and I would wish to elucidate the audience or remind them, for those who may already be aware, that the purpose of reforming the statutory corporations and the necessity, certainly the necessity predates the current administration. It speaks of one of the structural weaknesses in the public finances, where you have a number of inefficiently managed state-owned enterprises, and as a consequence, government has to transfer on an annual basis significant sums and cumulatively hundreds of millions of dollars to a number of state-owned enterprises. And notwithstanding doing so, the public is left to wonder the extent to which they're receiving quality public services from many of these state-owned entities. But the imperative is that by reforming these entities, maybe divesting some of them, or that is to sell some of them, or just closing some of them down, the intention is that better government services would be provided at a lower cost to the taxpayer ultimately. And the budget not only lacked to update the public on where the government is at with respect to that initiative, but on the contrary, the government announced the creation of a number of new entities. Think of Business Barbados, for example, a number of new commissions. So a new Teachers Service Commission. Now, some of these things may be of merit. That's not what I'm questioning here. What I'm questioning is the extent to which the government has made a commitment to reduce its reliance on borrowing by reducing its fiscal deficit, to increase the efficiency of tax collection with the view of increasing tax revenues, and also to curb wasteful public expenditure. What we've seen over the course of the last 6 years or so is considerable effort to increase tax revenue by various tax initiatives and increases in fees and user fees, as well as efficiencies in the administration of taxation, some of which were either announced or alluded to in the most recent budget. But we haven't seen any sustained effort to reduce expenditure and improve some of the structural weaknesses in the public finances. And what that says to me is that the government, by its policy action, is demonstrative of a government that prefers to increase the burden of taxation on Barbadians and on Barbados, as opposed to reduce or limit or rid itself or as an institution of the many areas of wasteful spending. And as a matter of fact, the government, by its commitments in this budget and the recent estimates of its revenue and expenditure as well, have committed to increasing expenditure quite substantially in a number of areas, again to the detriment of taxpayers. So to me, it begs the question: does the government believe that it is better placed to spend Barbadians' money than Barbadians are so to do on their own? And what, in my view, what we've seen as a consequence of this policy trust or this policy posture is public finances that have improved, yes, but an economy that is increasingly burdened by the dual impact of a high cost of living and a heavy tax burden. Regarding business, the announcement of Business Barbados, which I heard praised in one of the post-budget forums by some stakeholders, which begs the question to me. It does seem in public commentary too often there appear to be an ethos where persons are eager to heap praise on the government or the Prime Minister in particular, where it is not merited. And why am I saying that with respect to the announcement of Business Barbados? Are we to believe that the announcement of entity called Business Barbados that is intended to improve or coordinate the doing business in the country is to be successful without any real concrete details on how this entity is proposing to be able to achieve that? When what is actually required is that the existing government entities, whether it's corporate affairs, whether it is Invest Barbados, whether it is the licenses authority, whether it's town planning department, ought to be improved both in terms of systemic change, technological change, and if needed, managerial change to ensure that they provide the quality of public services in a timely manner that they were created so to do. Superimposing an entity, another statutory corporation in government under the guise that somehow it is going to be able to transform government or the various touch points for doing business in the country is really a fallacy and just another layer of bureaucracy that is likely not to yield any tangible results. And that is really just but one example of the budget. A lot of heavy weather was placed on battery storage and government financing battery storage. when the, the policy with respect to and the policy targets with respect to alternative energy and the capacity of the grid are flawed, and it would be better to correct or address those flaws rather than to double down on them in a very costly exercise that isn't likely to result in the benefits that it portends. And then you have the question in that regard to the cost to consumers with respect to the electricity costs, and that is both households, but it's also businesses, and the impact of those higher costs on doing business in the country and the competitiveness of the country. So in that respect, the government really do need to go back to the drawing board, heed the advice of those who are competent and have experience and professional acumen in the area. I speak of the likes of Trisha Watson, Lieutenant Colonel Trevor Brown, and there's a gentleman that I heard recently on the That Sunday program that was hosted on VOB, a Barbadian who has extensive experience in the United States in this area. And the consensus there is really that the government really does need to go back to the drawing board and to truly approach the policy in this area in a consultative manner and rescue what is now a fledgling alternative energy industry. Some of you may recall that as far back as 2021, I did say publicly that the alternative energy targets were unrealistic, overly ambitious, and not likely to reap the rewards that the likes of this central bank and government spokespersons have been telling or conveying to the public. That has come home to roost. And now we have an alternative energy sector that is in crisis. And certainly from the enunciations in the budget, they make no meaningful contact with addressing or ameliorating the challenges in that sector, and proposes to impose considerable costs on taxpayers for an ill-conceived, misguided policy
Uh,
frolic. So I'll stop
Carlos,
there for now, and
what?
I perhaps would
Yes,
address the crisis in government's housing policy as well, which also was addressed in the
yes,
budget.
yes. We're gonna get there. That just crossed my mind. I say I really wanted to ask you what your thoughts about housing, but we're not gonna get there. I wanted to uh indulge you in a alternate view, per se, and this alternate view is just a video featured on CBC, and it has a fellow economist, Dr. Clay Maskell, speaking. It's about 2 minute video, so I'm just gonna ask you to give me your thoughts on it. So we're gonna play it here. Hmm. Hey, it is loading.
Yeah, while the video loads, I'll also make the point too that um, the certainly I did not recall any major policy announcements with respect to the or what was formerly called the international business
You
sector.
can see my screen, or
Yeah, I can see your screen, but it's just showing that it's loading.
it's taking a while. So you can go ahead and make the comment in the meantime.
Yeah, you can probably just refresh the video. Yeah, I was making the comment that again, this is not a partisan issue because I would say the decline of the international business sector started on during the Stewart administration. Not necessarily their fault either. There's a number of things that happened internationally that eroded some of the competitiveness in that sector. But I just want to quickly make the point that neither the Stewart administration and so far neither the Motley administration has really brought any policy initiatives to bear that would be intended to restore growth in that sector. That sector, though not measured in the official GDP reporting outside of its tax contribution. That sector was a pretty significant contributor to Barbados's economic growth and consequentially development, and not only in terms of the contribution to government's corporate tax revenue, but a lot of linkages with the tourism sector, conferencing, professional services, high-paying jobs. Many of persons who work in that sector have moved to other countries. Some of the other international business domiciles in the Caribbean. Some of them moved to Canada, United Kingdom, etc. And some of the challenges in that sector are difficult ones, but I think it's just important to mention that the the lack of any real policy trust of how that sector can be resuscitated and sustained. Um, it was a glaring omission, not just of the most recent budget, but recent budgets over the last eight 8 years or so.
Taking yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're
So
ready?
Carlos, I am
Yeah.
going to play the video now. I think we have it good. So we're just gonna.
There were, in fact,
Yes.
15 issues identified in order to encourage the growth of the economy in the short first and then mainly in the medium term. So that is what impressed me so much about the budget, in that it is both a short term, and I will explain that soon, and a medium to long term initiative in terms of sustaining economic growth and development in Barbados. So institutional reform was critical in the approach.
What are the reforms associated with the state-owned enterprises? But I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, because what we're finding, and I'd say this in general across the Caribbean, is that the public sector is becoming a bit of a drag on the rest of the economy. And I think we really need to have an honest discussion and a factual discussion around that, as to say, what is the role of the public sector? Is the public sector facilitating real growth in the economy? So facilitating Mr. Abed.
Hi, Carlos. I think my computer was frozen. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you now. We lost you there for maybe 30 seconds or so.
Yes. Well, my thing is has thing. Yes. So right. We watched the video. I don't know if you heard the comment clearly from Clay Maskell, and I don't know if you heard the comment from just Dr. Justin Ram.
Yeah, so I can recap what I heard. So I heard Ambassador Maskell made reference to about 15 different growth initiatives that were mentioned in the budget. He characterized them as being focused on institutional strengthening. I suppose that was with respect to within the public service. And then those comments were juxtaposed against comments from Dr. Justin Ram, who lamented that we need to have a serious conversation in the region about meaningful reforms to public institutions and the extent to which government institutions or government is being a drag on economic growth and development in the region. And from what I've heard, and I pretty much that's all that I heard. What I gathered from that is that Dr. Ram's comments more or less contradicted Ambassador Maskell's comments. Is that an accurate representation?
Well, I agree with you. I get an echo. So, sorry about that. I get some interference on the feed. So just bear with me. But yes, what you said was fairly accurate in terms of the contradiction. I heard what was interesting is that Dr. Justin Ram, his comment, which spoke about the public sector being a drag on modern Western economies. No, that rhetoric is more hyper neoliberal type of policies where you recommend for the public sector to be into more private oriented operations. You privatize areas like water, airports, and the more commercial entities, you sell them off. That might work for some larger, more industrial economies who have the capacity to maintain and who have private sector, who have a large private sector, who takes risks and who will be able to fill the void as it relates to, as opposed to government crowding out. You have the opposite effect. When government falls back, the private sector will step forward and take up the slack. No, everybody knows that the private sector tends to operate with the mentality of a welfare recipient, and that Caribbean private sectors take risks only if they have government guarantees and government backings. Right? So to change, and referencing Dr. Ram's point, so to change the institutional outlook of the public sector, particularly in Barbados, where you have a private sector that is risk averse, then I think you're treading on dangerous grounds, unfamiliar territory where Barbados may not, or Barbadians may not know how to suffice in such a new space. Now, Dr. Maskell, I was speaking about economic growth and 15 areas of growth. But as you rightfully said, Carlos, in your initial statements, there's no detailed plan to reference the SOEs, which goes back to Dr. Ram's point. So the SOEs are still a drag on public finances, right? And then we know that government's renewable energy policies are dead, right?
where are they going to get the policy space to reduce foreign exchange earnings on oil and other things, whatever we use it for an exchange for, if the renewable energy policy is basically not viable or possible by 2030. So on those two premises alone, I don't have to go into the others, but on those two premises alone, your point is solid when you say that Dr. Ram contradicted Dr. Maskell, and Dr. Maskell provided a surface level explanation, which when you provide the facts, you could clearly see that is an emperor without any clothing.
Yeah,
Now,
so I had not heard the discussion or watched the full video. I was hoping that Dr. Maskell would have gotten into identifying what those 15 major initiatives were. I don't know if he did that, but that it would have been useful to do that if he didn't, so that we can discuss at least some of them. With respect to Dr. Ram's comments, what I would say is that you don't necessarily, well, I would caution against moving his comments into an ideological political economy ideological framework, and perhaps consider his comments in the context of asking the question: does government provide efficient, high quality public services in general to the Barbadian public? And we can, I think most Barbadians can assess many of the government departments that are public facing, whether it's the Barbados Revenue Authority, the licensing authority, town planning, etc., where the public, the registration, the Supreme Court, where the public has to access various services, and ask yourself the question whether or not those services are provided at a high quality, whether the customer service that is rendered by public servants to the public is of a high quality, and whether or not they're provided at a cost, not necessarily to the recipient of those services, but the cost to the taxpayer that represents value for money. And I think the answer to most, if not all of those questions is no. And if the answer is no, then you have to ask yourself, does a government have the capacity and the wherewithal to bring to bear improvement in the delivery of those public services? And I think that answer could be yes. So that improving services do not necessarily mean divesting them into public hands. As a matter of fact, some of the services that government provides wouldn't be commercially viable being provided privately. The licensing authority or the tax administration that is conducted by the BRA, for example, the town planning. These are not things that would be desirable to even contemplate outsourcing to private hands. But are there governments in other parts of the world that are able to provide these services efficiently and of a high quality to their respective publics? So I think if we reflect on Dr. Ram's comments in that context, we could have a greater appreciation for what he was driving at. The other aspect of his comment, a drag on the economies, well, drag on economies is high taxation. And where there are inefficiencies and wasteful spending in the provision of public services, where there are entities, to use Barbados as an example, such as the Urban Development Commission and the Rural Development Commission that did not exist prior to the Oinata administration. And since the Oinata administration provides no real substantive function with respect to delivering meaningful services to the public. It begs the question, why do they still exist? The consequence of that approach to public finances is that you have to borrow or raise taxes to cover that wasteful spending. And higher taxation is a drag on the economy, in as much as the government is extracting more out of the economy from both individuals and businesses that they themselves can use for their own economic endeavors and economic well-being. So I would advise taking Dr. Ram's comments in that context, as opposed to the ideological question of whether privatization is meaningful or not. There are some entities that would be candidates for privatization, but there are others that would not be. There are some entities that it may be reflexive to consider them to be candidates for privatization on the basis that private sector.
Give examples, please.
To the extent that or with the presumption that private entities may be able to provide these services, more efficiently and make a profit. But it is important to recognize that there are commercial entities in other jurisdictions. Think of Canada, for example, which has a liquor control board that has a monopoly on selling alcohol, for example. The province of Ontario runs a lottery. They own a electricity company, among others that are managed well and run well. And as opposed to being a drain on the public finances, they actually contribute substantially in dividends on an annual basis to the government. And the province of Ontario or the government of Canada are not the only examples across the world where governments are able to run government-owned commercial entities in a manner that is on a commercial basis that results to the benefit of taxpayers. The question is, do we have the political will in Barbados to embark on the type of arm's length institutional strengthening without political interference, to have some of these entities ran on a commercial basis where they're able to charge or adjust their rates for their services without any political interference, and result in the benefit of the government. So these are a lot of
before we move from that point,
yeah,
I would want you to explain. I'm gonna make it practical. The practical point here is, you just said that there are some institutions that we could separate the political attachment to it and allow the institution to function in a way that they could charge the appropriate rates, levies, fees, whatever, to become a profitable entity. Now, in my mind, and I wrote about this in Alternate Views as well, the Barbados Water Authority is such an institution, and even the IMF, as far back as 2007, was recommending to the government of Barbados that the automatic adjustment upward in the price, meaning the price increase of water, would put the water authority on a more sustainable financial path. But still, massive increases in water rates across a small island like Barbados, where the population traditionally enjoys subsidized water rates. How then do you how does a political institution justify, especially both we have practiced democratic socialism, so how do you then justify a shift in philosophy, i.e. the reduction of subsidies water, or well, it was announced in Barbados that we're going to have a change at the top in terms of management, how the management rights of water authority, much like what we have at the airport, which are going to be two public-private partnerships. Both these institutions are going to be PPPs. So how do you justify something like that to the public?
Yeah, these aren't decisions that should be made on a knee-jerk basis or even a philosophical basis, in my view. These are matters that should be subjected to. There's a lot of talk about consultancies and so on. These are areas where I suppose the legitimate or the beneficial use of consultancies can be brought to bear, where these entities are subjected to. And when I say consultancies, I'm talking about management consultancies such as Deloitte, the KPMG, or what have you, where these entities are examined both in terms of their financial management, their operations, etc. An assessment is made with recommendations, and then decisions are made whether or not or how many of those recommendations would be taken, with the intention of improving how the entities are managed, because that ultimately has an impact on whether or not they're being run efficiently. So that is not just a question of whether or not you're raising rates. You may very well find that there are enough restructuring that can be done to eliminate wasteful spending that it may not be necessary to raise rates. It can be a hybrid situation where the government continues to commit to the entities, if you're using water authority as an example, capital investment over the course of some time into the future. And the entity is then left to be managed in terms of cost recovery, in terms of water rates on its operations and not its operations and its capital needs. So there are a number of different ways of approaching these types of matters. I think, when I say we, I think the public was led to believe that it's that type of exercise that the government would be embarking upon under the IMF program. And the question I have is that after 6 years, what is the evidence of government carrying out this type of exercise of assessment and reform to say to the public, these are the options, these are the pros and these are the cons associated with these particular recommendations, and take the public into its confidence, because the fact remains, and again, this is not a partisan issue. This has been an intractable issue now for decades, where the country, in particular the government, has long been living above its means. And just as with a household, if you live above your means, it means that you are going to be increasingly indebted. You have to borrow to make up the shortfall. And that brings us to where we are, or where we have been in recent years, and where we still are, where the estimates of revenue and expenditure for this year budgets for a deficit in the region of just under $1 billion, right? Deficits over time accumulates, and if the economy isn't growing faster than the accumulation of deficits, the country becomes more and more indebted over time. And we've already had a very bad experience, sobering, but also bitter experience of having to have a debt restructuring, which impacted those who would have lent to the government adversely. But it also had the detriment of eroding public confidence in government, in terms of lending to government. And that is in part the reason why the government still continues to have difficulty borrowing on the domestic capital capital markets and financing, being able to adequately finance its deficit from domestic sources. So you can't have it both ways. You can't want, whether it's the government or whether it's the population, you can't want the world and at the same time be averse to accumulating debt. And if the government is to borrow in a way that is responsible and sustainable, then it really needs, and again, not necessarily the monthly administration, but government as an institution. It has to correct the structural weaknesses in its public finances that ultimately, the failure to do so imposes a higher tax burden on the public and renders the country less competitive or erodes competitiveness, and much to the warnings or the concerns that was being raised by Dr. Ram with respect to a drag on economic growth going forward.
Yes, well, thank you for that, Carlos. Something you said in your explanation, in the budget, you just said, and I'm taking from the budget here as well, that we are trying to restart domestic capital markets, right? So we do carry an audience that is not versed with the terms and the terminologies of economics. So what I like to do is to break it down and explain it for the layman, you know, for the sanitation worker, for the vendor, for the factory worker, for the housemaid, for the average 13-year-old, 14-year-old. And even if you can get it broken down for the primary school child, we would do that. So, so I'm basically say here, you said restarting domestic capital market. So that is basically the government trying to borrow locally again. Domestic dollars, government trying to borrow from Barbados or Barbadian institutions or Barbadian registered institutions again. So we have the Central Bank of Barbados is an institution who lends the government of Barbados money. We have the local financial system, which would involve the commercial banking sector, and we have the insurance sector, we have the credit union sector, and then we have the finance companies like Consolidated Finance, Accel Finance Trading, those type of companies. And then we had the area of government treasury bills, right? Is where government borrows its money from locally. So that is based, what we just give are the players in the domestic capital markets, right?
And individuals,
yes,
pensioners and individuals that have what economists call surplus funds.
Yes.
So money that they
investor
either save or invest, and so they buy government instruments to get a predictable return that usually is a safe investment.
Yes. So those are the persons, the players on the board. So the government is trying to re-engage with these people, right? The reason why they became disengaged in the first place was because of the debt restructuring in 2018, where the government would have written off the money owed to these persons and entered into a debt restructuring, debt repudiation exercise, etc. On one side, it caused us to be banned from private international markets, as I said earlier, and then on the other side, we slowed down significantly on the borrowing because we were mainly taken from the central bank in terms of printing money and from the national insurance. And the national insurance went through a restructuring, and the central bank as well went through the restructuring as well, causing at least $1 billion per institution in losses. And then the government passing legislation which would have restricted the Central Bank of Barbados from printing, at least I think it was about 10% of GDP or so at any given time. So that was 2018. Now, fast forward to 2024 in the budget process, we are trying to reverse that policy. So, could you give me an explanation or understanding as to why only after a couple of years, 2 IMF programs, we're actually now trying to basically eat our vomit and walk backwards to try to rekindle domestic capital markets, as opposed to other options, I suppose.
You're giving the government more credit than you should. So if the government would have portrayed it as a policy, or in effect, it would seem like a policy, but it really was by necessity. The domestic creditors were unwilling, and still are in large measure, unwilling to lend government money after the debt restructuring, and therefore it had to rely more on foreign sources to finance its deficit. It's really as simple as that. So it isn't so much that the government is seeking to reverse its policy. I think the government has recognized that relying predominantly on foreign debt is not sustainable, because it has to be paid back in foreign exchange when it falls you down the road. The country has a long-standing challenge or difficulty in earning foreign exchange, whether that is from exporting goods or tourism services, the international business sector, whether that's from foreign direct inward investment various sources, usually in the tourism hospitality area, homes, villas, and so on. The country has had that challenge for decades, and none of the last 3 administrations have not made any demonstrable progress in turning around those misfortunes in terms of the country's ability to earn foreign exchange. So the government knows that, notwithstanding what they may have been saying to the public in the preceding 6 years about cheapest money in town, lower interest rates, all of that. It's really a case where government borrowed from where money was available to be lent. So to be in lay terms, I suppose, and in colloquial terms, people, Bajans didn't want any government any money. They got burned from the restructuring. They lost confidence in the idea that buying government bonds or treasury bills is a safe investment. Return is guaranteed. The debt restructuring demonstrated that that is not so, and people are still skittish. In circumstances where the government has accumulated debt quite significantly in the past 6 years, is also a reason for pause. So because of these reasons, government have not been able to access the amount of credit locally to finance its deficit as is desirable, and therefore it was relying on foreign sources. What the government is saying is that in recognition of the unsustainability of relying predominantly on foreign sources, we are trying to see what initiatives we can put in place to encourage, reassure, etc., domestic creditors to lend to the government again. And the recent estimates, what they're budgeting for is a substantial increase in reliance on domestic sources as opposed to foreign sources. Laudable objective. The jury is out as to whether they will succeed. Some of you may recall that in last year's budget, there was a lot of emphasis and initiatives announced that were intended to restore that confidence in the domestic credit markets. It has not yet, at least based on the money, the dollars, as the American expression, show me the money, based on the money that the government is able to borrow domestically. So far, that confidence has not been restored as yet. And we shall see if in the next financial year, or the current financial year, because we are now in April, ending in March next year, whether the government is successful in being able to raise the amount of money that it has projected in the estimates of revenue and expenditure.
Well, Carlos, I just like to tell you, show me the money was actually a horse at the Garrison. Let's not forget that. Right? So for you horse racing fans, who remembers Show Me the Money? Right? Who remembers Blast of Storm and Jonathan Jones winning the Gold Cup quite a few times? But that would be for the horse racing fans. Carlos, I don't know if you are a horse racing fan.
I am. I do like horses in general, but I will confess that I've not been able to follow domestic horse racing regularity since I migrated.
well, fair enough. Well, when you get a chance, you must take a stroll by the Garrison, preferably at day, not at night. And we watch the horse racing.
Last time I watched horse racing at the Garrison spontaneously. Actually, I met a friend at Graham Hall, and on my way back heading to St. James, I was passing with the Garrison, and I saw that there was horse racing, and my daughter was about 2 years old at the time, so that was about 8 years ago. I stopped and we watched a bit of horse racing there.
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Well, as someone is saying here in the comments, hope Carlos goes out to Woodbine. I actually have a friend who's a jockey. His name is Antonio Whitehall, and he goes up to Canada and he rides horses. He was very successful, winning a couple of trophies. Him and Patrick Husbands. So, but we don't want to go off on a horse racing tantrum, but we could do a whole soiree on that. But we didn't have economics tonight and the budget 2024, and it's going great. So far, we're having an excellent discussion, very informative with Carlos Forte. We're breaking down the budget. We're filling in the gray areas as it relates to Barbados's economic outlook. No, the reason why you would want to restart domestic capital markets is because indeed you're short of capital, right? You said we have a fiscal deficit that's around plus $1 billion, and we need to find the money from somewhere. So we borrow some internationally, IMF, IDB, we know the drift, and then we do locally. And let's remember the statement: we may not have new taxes, but we may have increases in current taxes. So expect some revenues to come from current tax increases. But where there's a hole in revenue, then governments go hunting to find that revenue. And sometimes that means tapping into institutions that are maybe offshoots of the government. And when I say offshoots, I specifically mean the Central Bank of Barbados being an offshoot of the government of Barbados and being an offshoot of the Ministry of Finance. And you raised the point, Carlos, and quite excellently, about government's housing policy, right? So in the budget, we had the Prime Minister speaking about 10,000 houses that are set to be rolled out as part of government's housing policy. And we had the Hope Project. And we all know about the Hope Project. As you know, he would have did an entire expose on the Hope Project. But here we have the Prime Minister announcing 10,000 houses in the plan to develop the Hope Project, which would have been partnering with the renewable energy sector. And these houses would have been putting PV solar panels on your house. They said that they were giving you the land for free. All you had to do was pay for the construction of the house, and they would put the panel on your house for about 20 years, and that would be basically it. Hope, as far as I know, was in the 2018 manifesto as a promise, and to finance Hope, right? Because remember, we made the point about a lack of revenues. So to finance Hope, here we have the reaching in by the government into the central bank's housing credit fund, right? To the central bank's housing credit fund to be able to finance the whole project, which means 10,000 houses. Now, it was said that $60 million from the housing credit fund was used to embark on the whole project as it is right now. And you don't have to hide it. The whole project is abandoned. All 4 sites of the whole project has been abandoned so far. And only about 131 houses, I believe, or so, out to the lot were complete. Right? So that, along with the Chinese houses, Carlos, right? And we had massive cost overruns from the Chinese houses, at least $23 million in cost overruns. So the project jumped from around 29 million to about 53 million or so. And only a few of the houses are complete. And that was taken directly from a special audit done by the Auditor General of Barbados. In Dominica, Carlos, you had a project called the Future Housing Program, which is much similar to the whole project. And that future housing program was intended to build 5,000 houses. And that was promised by the Prime Minister in Dominica to the population, similarly how we had a promise in our budget to build 10,000. So I want to know from you, Carlos, what is really happening in terms of the promise from the budget of 10,000 houses, the facts that they will just put on the table, and then you can broaden your scope and ask, what is really wrong that Caribbean governments or small island states at this side of the world find it almost impossible really to complete housing projects of a certain magnitude and certain scope and scale?
Well, the promise without performance is a comfort to a fool. And, you know, I personally try to resist the whole narrative about implementation deficit disorder. I think it unfairly shifts the burden of performance on the public service or the public sector, when many of these policies are ill-conceived and impractical in the first place. The promise of 10,000 houses in 5 years is 2,000 houses a year. When has Barbados been able to produce, or rather, the government has been able to produce 2,000 houses a year at any point in time over the last 50 years? It was an unrealistic pledge in the first place, and what we are seeing 2 years after the last general election where the pledge was made is the government falling woefully short of that commitment. And it's really as simple as that. If we were on track for 3,000 houses, perhaps you would say the government has fallen short, but you would see some measure of performance. And the fact remains is that these initiatives were poorly conceived. It sounds they're ideas that sound good. And, the Prime Minister in particular likes a lot of grandiose ideas and initiatives. The truth is that for all of her strengths and accolades, the Prime Minister's performance outside of crisis management in the public policy space over the 2 decades that she has been in public life has been a failure. I think of EduTech. I think of the New Dodds Prison, the financial arrangements associated with that, Crab Hill Police Station, etc. These projects have largely failed, or they've been exorbitantly expensive. The fact remains is that with respect to Hope, apart from the project management issues associated with the project, the business model upon which the project is based on is no longer workable due to the grid being at capacity with respect to alternative energy systems. So apart from HOPE, people who have sought permission and maybe went ahead to invest in new EV systems to attach to the grid have not been able to do so for the better part of the last year and a half or so. And so too with the HOPE project. So you have project management issues in terms of actually being able to build the houses. But you also have a situation where the financing model upon which the success of the projects are based on is flawed or stalled. And therefore, it is not surprising that the construction of houses under that initiative have stalled. With respect to the Chinese steel houses, same issue there, ill-conceived in the first place. I really am not convinced that the reason cited for procuring steel houses from China were the actual reasons that they were procured, but that's just my sensing. The fact of the matter is that the public was sold a bill of goods that the government needed to be able to build houses in a very short space of time within a 6-month period to restore persons to homes who had lost their homes due to Hurricane Elsa, and that the capacity to do so did not exist locally. Now we are almost, well, more than 2 years on, and no houses. So it really lays bare the nonsense that really the government was warned at the time about. I remember the government trying to defend that particular policy quite robustly at the time, when the likes of the engineering association and so on was really questioning whether or not, well, the first alleged that the government did not consult them, and also scoped out whether or not there are actually people on the island with the capacity to build houses, regardless of the type of houses that there are within that period of time. So once again, an ill-conceived project has just failed. And the Prime Minister announcing, commissioning a special audit for the Chinese houses and announcing an investigation into HOPE is really all just a small screen. And to quote a friend of mine, the Prime Minister is particularly skilled at being a great blame deflector. So this is really just an attempt to shift blame from her and her government. But the fact is that the projects were ill-conceived. Good ideas, or what seem to be good ideas, don't always translate into workable solutions. And I regret to say, again, this is not unique to this administration. Hence, someone has come up with this idea about implementation deficit disorder. I've worked in the public service in Barbados, and I've worked in the public service in Canada, and I can tell you that a lot of policy initiatives are conceived and announced without the requisite due diligence. And the whole policy cycle, is a skill and a process in of itself to move from idea to actual implementation. It's a process that sometimes you realize that, ideas that sound good or desirable are not actually practical. And a lot of the lack of implementation that we see in Barbados is a result of politically concocted ideas that just aren't practical policy-wise. Now, that's not the case for all of them, but quite a number of the initiatives fall into that category. And this is an institutional or structural crisis, really, that speaks to the need for reforming not just the public service, but how the public service functions with respect to the role between the cabinet and the senior executives in government, down to the frontline workers in government. And we get a lot of lip service about reforming the public service and transformation and so on. But the real intractable systemic issues, the antiquated systems and approaches to how governance is done in the country, there's a failure. There has been a failure, persistent failure to address that over decades. And these housing projects or housing initiatives are really just the most recent casualty of that.
Yes, but Carlos, I want to agree with you, and I also want to invoke Dr. DeLelle's Worrell's point, speaking about the public sector, and I also would have written that quote in Alternative Views as well, where he says that investment is chased away from Barbados simply because the time it takes to do and make regulatory decisions and the adequate decisions necessary to facilitate it, that is too tedious, and it always relates, both private sector and public sector, it always relates to some type of administrative failure within the public sector, which is to slow down the processes necessary to achieve eventual economic growth. Now, that puts me on to my next question to you. We borrowed money. But let me backtrack. There were promises from the time of the COVID where capital works was a thing. So we had the promise of the Sam Lars, we had the promise of the Hyatt, had the promise of the Pemberton Hotel, we had the promise of the Pierre Harry, the redevelopment project. We had a couple of capital works projects being promised to Barbadians, but hardly ever materializing. Again, we have some promises again of similar type investments. So it seems like we keep getting back the same statement year after year after year as it relates to facilitating capital projects to create jobs and drive economic activity. And it's just refreshed and a new hotel or two is added on every year. So this year the list got longer. So next year, if I follow history, we will get back the same list again next year and probably another two more promised hotels. So what is really the delay? What is really happening as it relates to facilitating capital works projects? It's particularly the Hyatt and these major investments that would drive economic activity, they always been stalled. Right? And I gave you the quote from Dr. DeLelle's, so you care to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I agree with his sentiments. He's also said in the past, rightfully so, that there are, for persons like Carson, Cadogan, and others, there are places in the world, in the real world, that actually exists where public services, and you would never have a public services that are provided as efficiently as private sector. Even in developed countries. But there are some things that the public sector does better than the private sector. And you do have countries that have very effective public services that renders services to their publics in a way that is of a high quality. Canada is one such country. Many of the Scandinavian countries are, Singapore as well. The United States is not the global superpower that it is by accident, notwithstanding the recent dysfunction in its politics. They have very efficient public services as well. The point of the matter is that there's the current government speaks a lot about being world class. There's a lot of scope to improve how public services are administered in the country. It doesn't require reinventing the wheel. It does require not a departure from the type of political patronage that result in putting square pegs in round holes, or what can be otherwise described as a friends and family approach to who is accorded senior positions within the public service and statutory corporations and even consultancies, and taking a more shrewd approach, and just to highlight the fact that I'm not being partisan in respect to this comment. I think Oinata did that a lot, sought to get the best talent wherever it existed, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of where that talent was domiciled, to bring to bear on the administration of public services. This government was not perfect, no government is, but there's a lot of success that he was able to brought to bear on the country, the longest period of economic expansion. The governments that followed have learned, I think, or I hope, that it's not simply a case of economies growing abroad and therefore Barbados economy will grow, but it actually takes active management. And active management is hiring the right people, putting the right systems in place, and I dare say incrementally reforming. You know, there's an adage in Barbados, a common adage, at least when I was growing up. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. I can tell you that developed countries don't practice that adage. They're always looking to see how things can be improved, how things can be made better, even when they appear to have been working fine. And that is the type of ethos and culture that we need to cultivate in Barbados. And the government can lead not by rhetoric, but by example in this regard, to bring some tangible improvements and progress that is meaningful, and have a lasting and sustainable impact on the country's growth and development, as opposed to the window dressing that we have been infected with now for more than a decade. So I do agree with Dr. World. A lot of the issue in the public service there's a lot of good people in the public service. And when I say good, I'm talking about talented and have the skill set. The cream doesn't rise to the top in the public service as it should, in Barbados public service, that is. But there's also a lot of antiquated systems that are still utilized in the public service. And again, this has to do with not taking an incrementalist improvement approach over time. So what you get is, we've been doing this for X amount of years, and that's how it is done, and that's how it should be done. We haven't seen the type of leadership at the political level to bring about the meaningful reform, systemic reform of the public service. That would require, without question, bringing the unions into the government's confidence, and really embarking on how can the public service be improved to the benefit of its workers and to the benefit of the Barbadian public, and of course to the benefit of present and future politicians who have to rely on the public service to implement and deliver on their policy initiatives. So I agree with Dr. World's sentiments wholeheartedly.
Speaking of reforms to public service and efficiencies in the public service, one big area of the public service that was focused on last year in the budget, which became effective this year, and that was a new feature for me in the budgetary process last year, where we are pre-announcing plans prematurely. So we would have been told last year, well, the pension age is supposed to go up this year, right? And the government is reforming national insurance, increasing the retirement age to 68, and then it goes up from there. are you in agreement with increasing the age to 68, eventually to 72, or do you think something more practical, like hiring much younger people who have a greater shelf life in terms of years and service in the public sector, as opposed to keeping people in the sector who may be aged, whose production may not be as it was before, you know, and maybe wanted to go home and enjoy going years, but being forced to work because of the increase in age. So you'd think going the route of hiring much younger people, giving young people jobs, and we're not talking about just sending home people, huh? We're saying those persons who would want to go home from the public service, we facilitate that, as opposed to, again, increasing the age and keeping them longer, way past the peak production point, are giving younger people who have much more time, again, in terms of years to the public service, a chance to get into government per se. So what are your thoughts about that?
So I've commented on this publicly on various occasions before. The last time I did so, it sparked some, I guess, public debate or controversy. My view is that there is no gainsaying the fact that the government's decision to write off $1.3 billion from the NAS had a negative impact on the fund. And my view is that the government, as an institution, should commit to repaying the INS, the National Insurance Fund, that money over the course of 30 or 40 years or so. And there are various ways that can be done. The other thing is that I personally, having reviewed the actual study and so on, my view is that a red line should have been drawn on the increasing the retirement age beyond the 67. 67 is already somewhat high. Persons should be allowed to retire early at a reduced pension, and you can argue that they can do so, but without a penalty that is sufficiently onerous that would discourage someone from retiring at 65, for example, or 64. And recognizing that part of the issue is the 10,000 approximately decline in population between 2010 and 2020, and that the government is correct that there's a need to boost Barbados's population. Very different with the government is that I believe that should be done in a very managed way, and that is not an automatic thing that you bring in people and the economy will grow, but you have to do that in a way that is managed in terms of skill, labor, and so on, and that there's not going, given the state of the NAS and the demographic challenges in the short term, it isn't an issue that can be corrected without some pain. So if it is that you agree with me that the retirement age should not be increased, it would mean, at the very least in the short term, increasing the contribution rate for the NAS. So either way, whatever you do is not going to come without some discomfort, and I dare say protestations from members of the public. But I think that in as much as I have said before, and I'm repeating it now, that the age of retirement, the mandatory age of retirement to receive a NAS pension should not be increased beyond 67, that it should be permitted that people who wish to carry on beyond 27 wouldn't be forced into retirement, because there are some professions that you can work to 70 if you so desire. Some, business executives, some people in the legal profession, etc., depending on the quality of their health, etc. And if persons have that desire to do so, they shouldn't be forced into retirement. But likewise, the retirement age should not be increased mandatorily, so that unless you retire at that age, you would receive a reduced, you wouldn't receive a reduced pension. I think people would wish to at least be able to live some period of time in retirement. And some people will die and wouldn't live beyond retirement, or may not even live to retirement. And there are some jobs, particularly labor-intensive jobs, where it is. And I use an example of the budget. The Prime Minister acknowledged in the budget that police should be allowed to retire early, given the earlier than they're currently permitted to retire, given the obvious physical demands of the job. All right. So if you can recognize that, you could recognize that there are a preponderance of jobs that exist currently where people wouldn't be conceivably able to work until 68 or 69 or 70. So it's for those reasons, I believe that reform should have a social conscience, and that there are other levers that can be adjusted to achieve the outcome of setting the NIS on a sustainable path that does not necessitate raising the retirement age. And so those are my views on that particular issue.
Yeah, well, I agree with majority of what you said. Like I said, I don't think the age should have gone up. In other countries, the age is 62 and 60, and and I think 67 is a very long time to wait for retirement. We're looking at people's most productive years. What can we get from a public servant? And I think by the time you reach that age, most people will still be fit. Yes, but I think we need to relook that. You said you would probably agree to increasing the contribution rates. I don't think that is unreasonable. As opposed to increasing the age to 70 or so. So those are discussions that could be open to public discourse, right? Have the public contribute to what they think about scenarios like that, as opposed to making a hardcore recommendation that you're going to increase the age to 68, then to 70, then to 72. Now, I let you read the actuary review, and the actuary Derek Osborne, who has a copy of Alternate Views, by the way, would have said in the actuary review that the main cause of disruption at the national insurance was indeed the debt restructuring, right? So while the NAS could have been on a certain trajectory, I can't remember the exact amount, but the restructuring would have shaved off years that the NAS had till it was running itself into the. I can't remember the exact. Do you remember, Carlos?
I don't remember the exact amount. I think one of the government spokespersons indicated is somewhere in the vicinity of 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
And therefore they're sought to suggest that it was inconsequential. But if 1.3 billion is inconsequential, perhaps they can furnish the government with my banking details and they can give me a deposit. Of course, it's not inconsequential. And the notion that the shifting, it is appropriate to shift the burden off the taxpayers onto the INS because that was the effect of the $1.3 billion write-off, is that the taxpayers or the government has a much broader tax base to collect revenue than the National Insurance Fund. And therefore, if there's any questions as to who should bear that cost, it really would have to be the taxpayers as opposed to contributors. And for those that would argue that they are one and the same, they're not, because people, tourists, for example, pay value-added tax and a number import duties, etc. There are a number of tax, fuel levy when they hire cars and so on. The tax are related to the accommodation sector. So the base is far broader in terms of who pays taxes versus who contribute to income tax, to national insurance. Indeed, pensioners are not contributing to NIS. They're receiving pensions. So this is really just, to put it very frankly, a nonsense comment by those government officials that sought to make that comment. And the fact is, it was a policy decision. They made a policy decision. It's not necessarily surprising to me, given who runs the government, or who leads the government, I should say. This idea that you can just write off money and it has no consequence. It does have a consequence, and a very tangible consequence. But yes, I think it was about 2 to 3 years. But it really just underscores the point that there is a demographic issue. It's not unique to Barbados. And for context too, I think those countries that have retirement ages at 60 and 62, they too are contemplating raising those ages. It's just that there's a more intractable fight to do so politically in those jurisdictions. But even without outward migration, there's a demographic issue of the baby boomer generation. Many of us, our grandparents, had at least 5 children. Some people had 10, 11, etc. The average amount of children per household has declined considerably since the 40s and the 50s. And therefore, it was always going to happen that at some point in time, you will have a significant share of the population retiring versus those who are working. And even though many people believe that NAS works in a way where you put money there and is waiting there until you retire, it doesn't actually work that way. Some of that money is invested. The what would be called the surplus funds, and the surplus funds would be the difference between the contributions and what is being paid out currently in pensions that is invested. But the pensions are actually paid in part by those who are contributing right now. So those who are working and contributing right now are in part contributing to the pensions of those who are receiving pensions currently, and then the excess where there's a surplus that is invested. So that's how it works. So if the amount of people that are contributing is shrinking versus the amount that are receiving pensions, then the fund would be an unsustainable path. So that's the impact of the demographic issue. And yes, the country needs to see how it can increase its population right now, but also into the future. So initiatives to encourage people to have more children, that is, even if those were successful, is not going to yield any fruit until decades down the road. And therefore that leaves you with immigration being migration being the immediate solution, in part to restructuring or setting the NAS on a sustainable footing. I hope that the whole exercise have taught not just politicians, aspiring politicians, and the general public that the National Insurance Fund is not a free-for-all that should be used at the whims and fancy of the government of the day to finance government initiatives, and that investment decisions by the National Insurance Fund should be just that, investment decisions made by trained, qualified fund managers. And that's one of the reforms that I had recommended when they were doing the consultations, where the fund is run at arm's length, and those decisions as to whether to buy government paper or invest in a prospective tourism project, or who knows, down the road, a medical marijuana project, should be a purely investment decision and not at the behest of a minister or a cabinet. Yeah, are you there, Kimar?
Yes, I am here. Right, sorry. As you were saying, you just made an excellent point in terms of the management of the national insurance. I think politicians, you've seen instances where ministers of finance, let me say that, ministers of finance, prime ministers, whatever, have used the national insurance fund to do things that maybe they shouldn't have been doing. Right? So when we could put the statement on the table about the use of money and the best use of money. We invested NAS money in Four Seasons. We invested NAS money in the Apes Hill project. We invested NAS money to rebuild the fire station. Right? But when you look,
and you know, again, the Stewart administration, former DLP administration, also excessively used national insurance funds by compelling the national insurance to purchase government instruments, bonds, debentures, etc. Even at a time when government's credit worthiness was deteriorating. So from the point of view of the present government, you know, the previous administration has some responsibility to bear, and the fund being so exposed to government paper to the extent that they embarking on a debt restructuring was faced with a decision where they, you know, they decided to write off some of those funds. So again, it's not a partisan issue, and I would take this opportunity to remind Barbadians that, you know, our politicians they're Barbadians. They're part of us. They went to school, the same places that many of us went to school. They were socialized in the same society, etc. And their incentives and their drivers for decisions that they make are shaped by the expectations of the public. And you know, so the public does have some responsibility in terms of holding any government to account, not cheering on the government because they are selling things to them that sound sexy and sound good, without asking the question, how is this really going to be paid for? Is this something that is going to be meaningful? Is this going to resound to the benefit of whether the public or, in the case, contributors to the fund, rather than getting too carried away in sentimentality and party colors, and because I support this particular party, whatever they do is okay. I dare say that you get the best government when whichever government is held to account, and there's competition in that political space, and that the expectations of the public is to hold their governments to the highest standard, regardless of its political stripe. Because if we are all in this together as Barbadians, if we all want to see the country succeed, then, you know, we have to have high standards, and the best way to show love is to hold your friends and loved ones to a high standard, and probity, and good governance. You know, so you know, I feel strongly about these matters, and that's part of the reason why I weigh in on these things publicly. I have benefited considerably from being a Barbadian and going to school in Barbados and going to university. I'm working for some time there. My family is there. Many of my friends are there. And like many of you, I want to see our nation do well. I believe it has the potential to do so. I believe it has the human capital to do so. But we must, um, you know, abandon the type of slackness and malmanagement and poor approaches to governance, whether that be in the public sector or the private sector.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Carlos. We're going to wind down on that point. There's a question that I put up on the screen briefly, not we don't want because we don't want to open up additional talking points. So just give me a brief thought on what you think about this question here, and then we're going to do a quick wrap up as to the entire discussion that we had for tonight. But thank you guys for tuning in. We are about 300 persons tonight, so thank you all for being here. The discussion was going, so we didn't get much interaction from you, or I didn't get to reach into the comments to interact with you because we were going at it very seriously. So thank you for sticking in the discussion and putting your comments up. But Carlos, I want your thoughts quick on this thing about the government purchasing back shares of the Barbados Light and Power, as well as reestablishing a national bank. And I know Colin Roach will be very interested in hearing your response to this as well. So go ahead.
I would say the heart of the person or persons asking the question are in the right place. It would be desirable to do so, but I'm afraid that we, at least at present, and over the course of the medium term, are not in a position so to do without trade-offs or significant trade-offs, which would be foregoing other priorities of the government or the public. So it would be ideal and desirable, but we simply can't afford to do so. It is true that the sale of the National Bank, though it resulted in some benefits to the economy more broadly, the negatives may have outweighed those benefits in as much as many of the not only public sector sale of entities such as the Barbados Light and Power or Barbados National Bank or Insurance Corporation of Barbados, but the private sector sale of some of these large entities have resulted in considerable foreign exchange leakage, where dividends have to be repatriated to the foreign owners. And I think some of the challenges with respect to foreign exchange, the foreign reserves, that were made more acute after 2008, not only on account of the Great Recession, but on account of a number of these large entities being divested to foreign interests. There are policy benefits to a government owning, and especially in a small country that's dominated by foreign banks, owning a commercial bank. But again, we can't afford to seek to turn back the hands of time and reacquire those assets that were divested. Perhaps what would be more realistic is for the government to establish financial institutions such as a export development bank, or some type of risk capital financing institution. What's risk capital? So risk capital is like things like venture capital, where high risk endeavors that may have a lot of potential are afforded access to capital in various types of structures. Where they are successful, there's ownership, or share ownership is retained by the investors and so on. perhaps those types of endeavors, starting off relatively small, and incrementally increasing the capital that's available to such entities as the demand increases, may be a better approach. With respect to the Barbados Light and Power, I think that is one that requires careful consideration. And I would say that perhaps a study can be done to see the feasibility in the medium term of seeking to regain or regain shares in, if not majority shares, or nationalize entity like the Barbados Light and Power, considering the obvious and apparent national economic interests, and that has been laid bare with respect to not owning or not having substantial ownership in the Light and Power, where we learned from the rate hearings that a substantial amount of profits from the Barbados Light and Power have been paid as dividends. The insurance fund has been, for lack of a better expression, raided by the owners, the ultimate owners, and the level of reinvestment has declined significantly from what obtained before it was majority owned or totally owned by Emera. So again, there would be meritorious public policy objectives, but the reality is Barbados cannot afford either endeavor at this point in time. When I say afford,
Yes, well, thank you for that. All I want to say is I agree with what you said in terms of heart being in the right place as it relates to wanting to own the shares of these entities again, but not having maybe the financial scope to do it over the medium to long term. I think the reason they were sold in the first place was because of the financial issues, but I think most of these entities have management issues as opposed to financial issues, and if you could cut out the wastage, these entities could be run profitable under the government.
Well, the BNB and ICB were profitable before they were sold.
Actually, my point.
Restructured to prepare them, I suppose, to be sold in the future. And there's a caller to the brass tacks, a retired gentleman. I think he formerly worked at BNB, and he tends to make that point. Any opportunity he's able to make it. It is true that they became more profitable after they were sold, but in both cases it was I certainly on the benefit of hindsight, even if you didn't think so at the point in time. We must be able to be swayed by evidence, and I think the evidence is that the net effect has been detrimental to the economic well-being of Barbados, and it was short-sighted in as much as they were trying to shore up the foreign reserves rather than living within your means or undertaking the necessary structural reforms to ensure that you are able to live within your means. So it's a very, very hard lesson learned, but I think as with life, you have to determine what you can do going forward and in the present, as opposed to looking back and crying over sour grapes. You try to learn lessons of the past and build towards the future.
Well, very important point to make, Carlos. I enjoyed this discussion tonight. I don't know about you viewers, but Carlos was top tier. His information was A class as usual. The way he was able to articulate the issues related to the 2024 budget. We were able to go back to address historical facts, and we were able to come forward to address what the future is like. We also provided practical solutions to the issues that you are facing, give practical solutions to the national insurance. And as Carlos said, with really consulting, economy comes into play. Because you have excellent minds like Mr. Fort, who have been speaking on the Barbados economy. Mr. Fort is experienced in the area. He was on a stint in Canada doing some economic work in the international world. And he takes the time out to deliver the unvarnished truth as it relates to the Barbados economy, and keeping what I call economic dignity. A country cannot survive if it has no dignity or national vision. So I wanted a quote here that I'm going to take from a book by a Bishop Andrea Thomas. And this book says, it speaks to the law of national vision. A national vision is a clear, compelling mental portrait of the optimum the people of a region can contribute, achieve, and possess if they continue developing themselves and maximizing their resources, opportunities, and people. Vision is the birthplace of greatness and economic dignity, and national greatness that cannot be seen, cannot be achieved. Economic dignity that cannot be seen in the midst of poverty cannot be materialized. The ability to see beyond what exists is what creates a visionary. Economic dignity is always led by economic visionaries who, like a sculptor, sees beyond the chunk of marble and sees within the marble the masterpiece he is about to sculpt. In this same way, successful transformational political visionaries sculpt economic dignity out of poverty and national greatness out of dependency. And in grasping the principles of national vision, a clear understanding must begin of what vision truly is, as opposed to ambition. Vision is always based on the greater that is waiting to exist out of what is at the moment. It is not a pipe dream in seeing the potential of the seed when the seed is still a seed. The stories of national economic dignity have always revolved around men and women who saw within the chaos of a struggling national economy a greater economy that was waiting to emerge. Leadership was given to take this picture of a greater future from concept to reality, and efficient management alone cannot produce economic dignity, as it is the effective use of available material, financial, and human resources to execute a predetermined goal. It can only maintain it after a political or economic leader has created it through people. Economic vision is to see the greatest version of the economy when it is still in seed form. Now, Carlos, that quote sums up the conversation that we had here tonight. Right? We spoke about in that vision about Barbados. We spoke about the economy and the way in which the people on this stream can realize and understand the articulation that we put forward in tackling the issues that they face on alternate views. So could you, in a couple of words, wrap up your contribution tonight and relate it to the short story that I would have given, and then we're going to wrap up on alternate views. So over to you, Carlos.
Well, I would just say that is a very profound quote. It's not just philosophical, but it's actually very, very practical and indeed very inspiring. I certainly found it inspiring. I hope the audience have found it to be inspiring as well. and it will motivate me to recap this this conversation, so that I can acquaint myself with that quotation and be inspired by it going forward. And I hope that you and the audience will be inspired, and certainly our leaders would be inspired by the same. Thanks again, Kimar, for inviting me to have this discussion on the budget and related economic issues. And thanks to your audience. And thank you for the questions that they pose. And more importantly, thank you for their public interest in the current affairs and the economic well-being of Barbados.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Carlos. Alternate viewers, we are at the end of our discussion. It's actually 9:40. So we're going to wrap up. You know, we like to stay disciplined. But Carlos, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. It was good to see you. It's good to have you back into the space, my brother. We're going to have you on more regular if it's your wish. You're very welcome to come on to Alternate Views whenever you have the time to grace us with your presence. So don't hesitate to come back on the program. There's going to be scope for much more discussions like this as the time rolls on, because as we get deeper and deeper into the IMF program, the opportunities will arise for persons who have the genuine interest in the country and in the general economy from a professional perspective and other ways to lay conversation and to forge conversation in the public space as it relates to Barbados and the economy. As was discussed on the show, we do have a very broad audience, international audience, a wide professional audience, as we had viewership from institutions such as the IMF, the Central Bank of Barbados, the Revenue Authority of the Bahamas, the Revenue Authority in Canada, chief executive officers of insurance companies, banks. We have a broad audience. Prime ministers from the region, permanent secretaries. We have a very broad audience on Alternate Views, and we have the viewers who make up the stream every Thursday. We have 258 persons here now. At one point in time, we went past 300. So the show is definitely building, and our viewership clocks in at roughly 3,000 persons, Carlos, within a couple of days. So without persons like yourself coming on and making the content fruitful, Alternate Views will not be getting the support from John Public. So I want to thank you, Carlos, for taking the time to come on. I want to thank you, viewers, for taking the time out to your Thursday evening. We're going to be back again next week. So look out for the ad. We may or may not have a guest, but nevertheless, we do have great conversation, even if it's just me and you. So I will look forward to seeing you all next week. Carlos, have a good evening. Viewers, have a good evening.
Have a good night.
I will see you all next week. Don't forget, Marcia Week Show is tomorrow at 7 p.m. Yes, 7 p.m. tomorrow, Friday. And last but not least, let me acknowledge the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, and to recognize the collaboration and partnership between the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute and Kimar Stewart and Alternate Views. And we will continue to acknowledge our partners wherever necessary. So with that being said, I am out of here, people. Have a good night. It is 9:45 p.m. Have a good Thursday afternoon. Bye, Carlos. Bye, viewers.